Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Kate Fineski, and I am Vice President of United Way of Greater Toledo. United Way of Greater Toledo is excited to present the first webinar of our new donor education series named Where Do Your Dollars Go? United Way believes when donors are empowered, we have the best chance to drive positive community change. And that is what these series are all about. Informing and empowering you with knowledge. Along with today's webinar highlighting nonprofit overhead, we plan 3 additional webinar topics, including using data to make decisions, which we hope will be out in around late May, giving plans for retirement, which we plan to share mid-July, and a lifetime of giving, probably sometime around September, targeting emerging leaders and establishing giving practices. All of these webinars are offered with your flexibility in mind. They'll be recorded so that they can be accessed at a later time. Please help us spread the word and share our future presentations with others. Now, let's get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about today's presentation. Jill Bunge is currently a development officer at United Way of Greater Toledo and formerly the executive director of Food for Thought. She is interested in making the nonprofit sector stronger by lifting the curtain on how organizations are both thriving and struggling to fulfill their missions. By building more trusting relationships between nonprofits and funders, she believes that philanthropic investments can be made more efficiently and provide a higher level of community impact. Jill is passionate about volunteerism and nonprofit collaboration and always eager to learn about innovative approaches to alleviating hunger, homelessness, and poverty. So Jill, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone for tuning in today. I'm really thrilled to be presenting for the first webinar in our donor education series. So today we'll be discussing where your dollars go when you make a donation to any nonprofit organization. We'll take a deeper dive to look at the financial structure of nonprofit organizations and really unpack what nonprofit overhead is as it relates to your philanthropy. And as Kate said, you're welcome to type any questions into the Q&A throughout the presentation, and I'll address those at the end. So let's get started. So I'd like to begin with some fundamentals. Nonprofit organizations have tax-exempt status because their work benefits the public good. In order for them to be in compliance with the IRS and retain that status, a tax-exempt organization has to file what's called a Form 990 every single year, and that includes a detailed overview of their expenses. So for these reporting purposes, nonprofits categorize all their expenses into 3 main categories. That's programming costs, management and operating costs, and fundraising costs. So when we hear about nonprofit finances, it's likely that many of us are familiar with the term overhead, but we might not know exactly what that means. So which of the nonprofit's costs are considered overhead? Any dollars that are spent on management and operations or on fundraising are part of what we call the overhead equation. And within management and operations, we have some additional categories like administrative expenses, facilities expenses, and any other indirect costs required for a nonprofit to fulfill its mission. So I would love to get some feedback from the folks who are listening in today. We have a poll question that we'd like to share with some folks. So the first question is basically, does a nonprofit's overhead guide your giving? So when you're making a decision about whether or not to support an organization, is that a factor for you? And secondly, how do you rank overhead as it relates to the organization where you do direct that philanthropy? And we have a scale down here where you can select kind of how important that is to you. Great. So we'll just take a couple more seconds now. Looks like people are pretty much weighing in. Wonderful. Okay, so I'll share those out. All right, so it seems like a pretty even spread. Not necessarily the top consideration for folks, but certainly something that people do seem to consider when they're choosing to put their dollars somewhere philanthropically. Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. So I want to talk now about how it is that we arrive at the overhead percentage. So when we're taking the different types of expenses into account, we can find the overhead percentage for a particular organization. So we take management and operating expenses and we add them to fundraising and then divide by the total cost of operations for the nonprofit in a given year. So in this particular example, we're looking at an $80,000 cost for programming, $15,000 in expenses for management and operating, and then this nonprofit is spending $5,000 on fundraising. That's a total of $100,000 for the year. When we do that division, that gives us a 20% overhead total for this particular nonprofit. So now that we know how to find that percentage, I want to drill down a little bit into what's typically in each of these expense categories so that we can better understand where this money is going. So we'll start with what falls under management and operating expenses. So the first are administrative costs, and these support the general infrastructure of an organization. A lot of this also revolves around human capital. So we're talking about staff salaries and training, any leadership development, strategic planning, data collection, which is so pivotal for organizations, the setup and maintenance of IT, and accounting costs. Second, we have facilities expenses at a nonprofit. So this is what it takes to maintain a brick and mortar building, whether that's an office space or a warehouse. We're talking about covering rent, utilities, and then any building maintenance. And this is something that I wanted to point out. One of the most common indirect costs that nonprofits have is for insurance. So in addition to insuring their physical space, like office buildings or warehouses or vehicles, nonprofits are also likely going to have a general liability policy. And this is extremely important when we're working with volunteers or vulnerable populations. Many organizations also have a directors and officers policy for their board of directors. The board is the governing body that keeps the nonprofit in good standing and guides the vision of the organization. And when we get into more comprehensive insurance policies, for example, covering a fleet of vehicles for a food bank, these can really become a significant cost for a nonprofit to incur. And finally, what falls under the fundraising umbrella within overhead expenses? So different agencies have different fundraising costs depending upon where their support comes from. And fundraising costs may mean staff who are directly involved in fundraising, pursuing sponsorships, writing grants, working with donors. It can also include dollars dedicated to marketing and advertising and mailing. So for instance, when a nonprofit sends out a printed newsletter or they're sending out success stories to showcase their work, that's sent to donors as a way to secure additional gifts. It has to be mailed directly to them. And so all of the elements that make that mailing possible are considered fundraising costs. And of course, we're all familiar with our favorite fundraising events of the year with the different agencies that we support. It's one of my personal favorite ways to support nonprofits. They're always a tremendous amount of fun. You get a good flavor of the organization. And all the time that's spent planning and organizing, the supplies that are needed, renting the venue, everything that goes into making that event happen would also be categorized under fundraising. So now that we have a better understanding of the expenses that are considered overhead, I would like to address the big elephant in the room. Why is overhead viewed so negatively? And what does that mean for you as a donor? So we know that you're just as passionate about a particular cause as the organization that you're supporting. That's why you're giving your dollars, or you're providing in-kind donations, or you're volunteering your time. And when we think about what drives donors to give, it's the programs that we love and believe in, right? So from a psychological standpoint, it is completely understandable that you want your dollar to pay for the best squeaky toy at the shelter for the adorable puppy, or to buy the healthy snack for the kiddo in an after-school program. What's less motivating is to pay for the animal shelter's accountant's bookkeeping software, or the insurance policy for the food bank's delivery trucks. It doesn't give you warm fuzzies, and I totally get that. I'm very aware. So that leaves a lot of donors wondering, if their dollars aren't going directly to programming, where are they going? And how do you know that a nonprofit is being a good steward of your gift? And that's a really fair question. So at first glance, we see this overhead percentage, and it looks like this neat, clean equation that can point to one statistic as an assessment to solve all of our problems. Unfortunately, the reality is it's only telling 1% of the story. And that equation itself has some inherent flaws. So when we base our philanthropic choices on that one statistic, it can really lead to some dire consequences for the nonprofit sector as a whole. So the numbers that are input into the overhead equation have reasonable variances from year to year that can significantly impact an organization's overhead percentage as different needs are arising. So as an example, from a cost or spending standpoint, say you're replacing your roof at the child care center one year. That's a major investment that's not typically in your operating costs, but will be reflected in your bottom line. So that type of expense would likely be categorized into facilities costs, making it a larger expenditure on overhead. Also, infusions of funding differ year to year, and there's not a ton of consistency as to when those dollars are going to hit the books. So as another example, with regard to dollars coming in, let's say a homeless shelter gets a grant to replace all of their beds. That's a large infusion of cash that's earmarked for a specific use. Or a major donor leaves a bequest in their will, which might be spent on hiring a new case manager that the organization didn't have the funding to staff before. These ebbs and flows in the nonprofit sector are really things that can move the needle on that bottom line number of annual expenses. And when we look at these scenarios on a case-by-case basis, I think few would argue that they're unnecessary or frivolous spending. Nonetheless, the way that they are categorized will give an entirely different overhead percentage from year to year. And frankly, some efforts just take more overhead than others. So for example, at the beginning of the environmental movement, the public did not understand the idea of cleaner air or water, which now it's something that's ingrained in all of us. It's hard to imagine a time when that wasn't part of the national conversation. But at that time, it was more expensive to raise money than it later became because there was so much education that had to be done around the work and the value of the work. So who's doing education around the importance of the cause? Who's making sure that dollars are coming in to support organizational programming? That's our super special folks in fundraising and development. So if we can imagine two fundraisers that are out in the world, one's trying to make the case to save puppies, and one's trying to make the case to save a very niche historic building. Can you guess which one of them is likely to have an easier time? That's the case, or more time will have to be spent cultivating that particular donor who cares really deeply about the niche work. So all that being said, higher fundraising costs don't necessarily mean that the nonprofit is less capable, hardworking, or fiscally responsible in all cases. So now I would like to make the case for adequate spending on overhead expenses. And please know before we begin here that adequate does not equate to exorbitant. And I'll touch on this a little bit more later. But what does happen when we underfund overhead? Underinvesting in management, operations, and fundraising is consistently linked through research with poor organizational performance, and it traps nonprofits in what the Stanford Social Innovation Review calls the nonprofit starvation cycle. So what happens here is that nonprofits will provide misleading reporting to keep their overhead extremely low for funders and donors, meaning they're bearing costs that should just be ordinary expenses to keep their organization functioning properly. Then that sets the bar for funders and donors to expect those lower percentages, which then makes nonprofits more inclined to continue to conform, and then the cycle begins again. So what does this ultimately lead to? I've broken this down into three main categories of impact. So first, I want to look at what that means for the nonprofit itself when we don't have adequate overhead spending. So it's my opinion that we as a society should have the best and the brightest on board to tackle huge social issues like poverty and inequity. It's an incredibly important job and one that can be very emotionally taxing. So when we don't invest in continuing education and training for staff, we have lower quality employees and higher turnover rates. And we all know how expensive it is to lose human capital with new hires and by having to retrain individuals. When we do retain staff, they may have lower productivity from burnout or inadequate resources to do their job because of underinvestment in facilities, equipment, and technology that allows them to work most effectively and efficiently. And finally, and this one is really important for you as donors to know, when there's inadequate investment in bookkeeping software or accounting and HR staff, there's just a diminished accountability and oversight within an organization. And that's what can make your donor dollars more vulnerable to mismanagement. So secondly, for funders and donors like yourselves, if nonprofits don't have staff or software to document their results and present that information to the public, they can't inform donors of the impact of their dollar. And that's such a huge thing for donors to know. I want to know what impact my gift is having. I want to know what work you're doing as a nonprofit. Can you show me your measurable outcomes? If there's no staff that's working on that, or software that's tracking that information, or a magical marketing person that's putting that together in a truly beautiful infographic, how are you to know where your dollar is being used? And next, when nonprofits aren't able to invest in fundraising, they become more dependent on fewer sources of funding. And diversifying funding streams is something that donors and grant makers are constantly asking organizations to do. And this ultimately makes their programming, the programming that people and animals that they serve are incredibly dependent upon, super vulnerable to cuts if revenue sources are going away. Additionally, many funders do not offer multi-year support, or they have stipulations against spending dollars on overhead costs. And finally, for the community, and this point is nearest and dearest to me, and I think one of the most important considerations for investing in overhead. So the places where people are served may be substandard if nonprofits can't invest in their facilities. So what this means is that we're forcing the most vulnerable individuals among us to seek the critical help that they need in places that are at best unpleasant and at worst unsafe. And frankly, this is unfortunately something we see all the time in the health and human services space. People who are seeking assistance, they're already swallowing their pride and sacrificing their dignity, have to walk into unpleasant places to get basic help so that they can better provide for themselves and their family. Now, my personal background is in hunger work, and I have heard countless firsthand stories from people who've had a traumatizing experience, or they've heard through word of mouth about a negative experience that someone else has had, and they never return to get assistance at a particular agency, even when their situation is dire. And finally, essential services are just offered at lower levels, or providers are struggling to maintain quality services because they have inadequate funding in their infrastructure. And overall, this ultimately leads to more program failures and less innovation, and the perpetuation of the very issues that we're all trying to solve as donors and workers in the nonprofit sector. So just to contextualize these points, I would like to share a few super spooky nonprofit horror stories with you. So the first is a personal example, and the other two are from one of my personal nonprofit heroes, Vu Le, who does amazing work out of Seattle with his organization Rainier Valley Corps. He's also a really vocal and visionary thinker in the nonprofit sector. So in my previous role, I was the executive director of a grassroots hunger organization based in Toledo, and we were hosting a collaborative fundraiser with another nonprofit in a historic building that was also a nonprofit itself. So it was a really wonderful collection of supporters from these three organizations and this awesome showing of camaraderie. And we had a lot of overlap in our donor base. So it seemed like a really wonderful come together for all of us to be able to collaborate. So we were launching a publication. We were raising dollars to support a food pantry in the building. And all of that magical, impactful heart melt stuff was all coalescing. And we ended up hosting at this particular location because the space was free and we were trying to keep our overhead costs low. So 2 days before the fundraiser, a boiler went out in this building, and it was the month of February. And if this current month is any indication of the weather as it was then, we all know that it was a little chilly. So we hosted this lovely dinner with fantastic music, and it was in a 50-degree room. Everyone kept their coats on throughout the night. And honestly, it was handled with grace, but I assure you, people were not clamoring to stay all evening. So all that to say, if we hadn't been concerned about the costs, we would have chosen a more comfortable space and it would have been a more lucrative fundraiser. So these next two examples are from Vu. And in addition to operating his own nonprofit, he convenes nonprofit employees and leaders from around the country through his blogs and social media, and everyone comes together to share some stories and ideas. So this particular nonprofit that reached out to him had such an outdated computer system that their entire database crashed. They lost critical data that they needed for a grant report, and all of their funding was pulled because they were unable to meet a deadline with the foundation. And finally, this one also speaks to me because in the nonprofit and philanthropy world, we all know these people, these absolutely wholehearted individuals who just selflessly sacrifice everything to make sure that good work is being stewarded. So there was a community leader who founded an organization in Seattle, which is where Vu is based. And through their programming, he helped the community over a span of 25 years. He never took a salary, and he's now nearing the end of his life and has nothing saved in retirement funds. So this is something, of course, I want to raise awareness around this to the greater public, but it's also something that nonprofits have to address internally within the sector. And VU has this really amazing tagline that drives that point home. Your crappy office chair should not be a badge of honor. Some organizations use this crappy chair mindset as a way to show that they're being thrifty with their expenses. And don't get me wrong, stewarding donor dollars is absolutely of the utmost importance. But this mindset starts to seep into other aspects of the organization that ultimately compromise the mission-driven work that we're trying to accomplish. So it encompasses crappy printers and crappy marketing materials and crappy professional development, inadequate pay for staff, and a lack of staffing support. And then people can't do their job to the best of their ability. And what suffers are the programs and the people that we care about most. So to sum up this section, while there's a lot of feel-good, warm fuzzies that are happening in the nonprofit sector, it is very complex work. It's constantly changing as our socio-political and environmental landscape are shifting in real time, and organizations really have to be nimble enough to keep up with the arising needs to make sure that people and animals and the planet are taken care of. And we really want people on top of their game and equipped with the necessary resources to do this. So where does this leave you as a donor? Without the overhead ratio, how are you supposed to tell if an organization is wasting money or if they're acting fraudulently? And that's a very important question and one that you should be asking as a donor. So here's advice that I would like to give you. While one equation isn't going to crack the code, you can ask some really wonderful guiding questions and do excellent research to know that your dollar is actually impacting the causes that you're passionate about. So I've listed some of these questions out here. And these, I hope, will better posture you to make informed decisions about where you want to direct your donor dollars. So first, how effective is the organization? Are they producing a desired result that you value? How efficiently do they carry out their mission? Are they showing you how they're leveraging dollars through their different fundraising initiatives? How many lives is the organization impacting? And here you can look for impact stories and the number of individuals that are affected by their work. How do other organizations compare who are doing similar work around the same cause? Are they serving people in the same way? Or is your preferred nonprofit operating programming in a way that makes them distinct or unique? Does the organization seem to have a vision for the future and long-term growth? Are they excited about the work? And do they envision a community that you want to live in? So as a donor, to get an even more comprehensive picture of an organization, you can also look at other aspects of their operations. So first would be transparency. Organizations should want to engage with you. They should willingly provide information about their programs and their operations and their finances. Governance. So you should be researching an organization's governance structure. Find out who sits on the board of directors. You can look into their background and their place of employment, what drove them to the work. This is the group that's guiding the vision of the organization. So that's a really important thing to research and know who is making sure that that vision is being implemented. On a similar line, the leadership. So who is the executive director or the president or the CEO? Who are the senior staffers? What's their background and how did they come to be in their current role? So these folks are taking care of the day-to-day operations and overseeing the implementation of the organization's mission on a ground level. And results. Look at what the organization is achieving and how their results are perceived among the population they serve and throughout the community as a whole. So of course, the financial piece of the organization is an incredibly valuable asset, but these things are just as important to be assessing before you're making a gift. So how do you go about this? These are 3 directions to point you in, and what I would like to call the nonprofit stewardship tool belt. And then I'll also provide you some resources where you can actually find this information. So first place you should look is the organization's website. Review that. If it's not already posted on there, ask the organization to provide information on their results reporting and other info on their goals and strategies and accomplishments. So as I said earlier, nonprofits have to file a Form 990 every year, which is publicly available online. In addition to that form, larger organizations will likely also have an audited financial statement that's completed by an independent CPA firm, and that's also generally made available. And finally, one of the best ways to get information is to reach out directly to the organizations you support. Responsible nonprofits are transparent about their operations, and they will be happy to provide you with additional resources to help you make informed giving decisions. They want to hear from you. They want to share their work with you, and they want you to be informed about the great work that your dollars are doing for the causes that you support. So some places where you can find this. These are three of my absolute go-tos, and these are three very highly regarded entities. The first is the Better Business Bureau Wise Giving Alliance. So this is a standards-based charity evaluator, and they actually have criteria where they verify the trustworthiness of nationally soliciting charities. So these are the larger organizations. Local Better Business Bureaus, though, will have certifications for local charities. Charity Navigator, their mission is to work to guide intelligent giving, and they also provide comprehensive information and reviews on an array of nonprofits. GuideStar, this is one I would say that I use most frequently, and I'm actually going to pull that up so you can check that website out. So this is what GuideStar looks like. So you'll go to the landing page, you can punch in a nonprofit, search for them, and then this is going to show you their EIN. It will pull up their mission. And GuideStar, they're providing information, on the basic principles of the organization, their legitimacy, the impact that they're having, reputation, their finances, including their Form 990. So you can access that and look at those forms dating back several years. Some of these websites have a paid version where you can see the most current 990. But other than that, you should be able to see from year prior and beyond. They'll give you a description of programs, governance, and they also have a really, what I like to look at, they have a lot of really great supportive resources. So they can look, or they give you some tips on how to guide your charitable giving. Charity Navigator has that as well. So different tips for donors, how to become a more informed donor. It's really a wealth of resources, and you can get into a really awesome nonprofit rabbit hole should you so choose to go down. But those are definitely places that I look to most frequently to make sure that a particular nonprofit is in good standing. So we will also be sending out after, at the end of this recording, when you get the recorded version of this webinar, we'll send you a resource guide, and we're also going to send you a letter. So these three entities actually penned a letter in 2014 that was addressed to the Donors of America. And their opening line was that we write to correct a misconception about what matters when deciding which charity to support. So the percent of charity expenses that go to administrative and funding costs, commonly referred to as overhead, is a poor measure of a charity's performance. So just to reiterate, these three entities penned this letter to the Donors of America in 2014. We'll be sending out a copy of that. But overall, what they said is that overhead is not a great measure of a charity's performance. And for these three entities to come out and say that is a really important thing. They're very reputable organizations, and as I said, a wealth of information to guide your giving. So I also do want to make the point that this is not an unabashed defense of excessive overhead spending. It's really a call to take a more in-depth look at organizations that are doing excellent work to protect the people, places, and animals that we love. These organizations are fighting every day for our rights and for our environment and our well-being. So our donor dollars are what make that possible. And I'm saying that as a donor myself to the causes that I choose to support. So just like you do proper research before you invest in a company, we should be digging deeper to make informed choices about how our dollars are making impactful work possible. And if part of that investment goes toward core infrastructure and the outcomes are more innovation and program successes and moving the dial on the most urgent and complex issues in our communities, then that seems like a really worthwhile return. So in conclusion, I would like to say that we at United Way truly believe that financial transparency is tremendously important, and it's really a pillar of our values. So when donors like you understand the financial structures and the processes for allocating program dollars, we can build this mutual trust. And that's a trust that ensures that your generous philanthropic investments are going back to the community and impacting the causes that you love. And when you have questions about your gift or your philanthropy or what issues and needs exist in the community, we're here to support you and to resource you and to help you understand the amazing impact that your gift has. So I'd also like to mention that we have some excellent opportunities for you to get an in-depth understanding about where your gift is going and how it's impacting programs in neighborhoods and our community as a whole. So each month, we're featuring site visits to some of our incredible funded partners, which are open to donors so that you can actually take a tour of these spaces and see the need that exists and talk to the individuals who are on the front lines and working to deliver these critical programs for people in Lucas, Wood, and Ottawa counties. Also, our United Way affinity groups, which are service focused, also provide a really unique opportunity to engage with organizations and schools and community groups through volunteerism. So those affinity groups that you're able to join are Women's Initiative, African American Leadership Council, Emerging Leaders, and Retire United. And finally, please check out our amazing blog. This highlights your donor dollar at work through the lens of our neighbors who are in need of assistance. And you can check all these things out and register for these events on our website, www.unitedwaytoledo.org. So thank you all so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. I hope this was informative. It's something that I'm really personally very passionate about. And I was really thrilled to have the opportunity to be able to put this together to share with folks. So we will be sending out a recording of the webinar. I'll also be sending out a PDF that has your nonprofit donor cheat sheet. So it'll recap some of the resources that I gave you, including the guiding questions and what additional things to look for outside of just the financial piece when you're making your philanthropic decisions to donate to a particular nonprofit. So appreciative for all of you tuning in today. You're welcome to reach out at any time. I'm happy to answer questions. Additional development officers at United Way are totally happy to do that. So please don't hesitate to contact us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Donor Ed series.
And remember, those next 3 donor series will be talking about using data to make decisions in late May, giving plans for retirement in July, and a lifetime of giving in September, targeting emerging leaders and establishing giving practices. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we really appreciate your time. Have a wonderful rest of your day.